The first time I saw a door close by itself on the vessel, I thought it was just the pressure shift from the deep ocean. But when the lock clicked from the outside, and I realized no one was there, I knew these weren't just mechanical malfunctions. Out here, hundreds of miles from the nearest shore, we live by 11 strange rules that keep us alive in the steel coffin we call a research ship. I remember the first time I broke one of those rules, and what waited behind that door still keeps me awake. The ocean doesn't forgive mistakes, and the vessel doesn't either. I had been on the research vessel for less than a week when the captain explained the strange protocols, and Rule 1: never open a door that locks itself. No matter what you hear on the other side was the one that sounded most absurd to me. Doors on ships always rattled or shifted because of pressure changes, and I had convinced myself this was just a way of keeping the crew alert. Still, the seriousness in his voice lingered in my mind, especially when he added that curiosity had killed more sailors than storms ever did. I laughed with the others when he walked away, but something in his eyes had warned me it was no joke. At first I ignored the thought of rules and focused on the work. My job was simple: catalog specimens brought up from the trench and monitor the environmental systems that kept us alive hundreds of miles from land. The vessel creaked with every swell of the water, a constant reminder of how small we were against the sea. The hallways were tight, metal groaning at night, and sometimes I imagined the walls themselves were breathing. I reminded myself that every sound had a technical explanation, though I noticed not everyone aboard seemed convinced of that. One evening I was working late in the storage bay when I heard a distinct metallic click echo down the corridor. It was sharp, deliberate, unlike the usual ship noises that blended into the background. I turned my head and saw the heavy door at the far end of the hall had swung shut. The lever had locked down into place, though I hadn't seen anyone pass through. I froze for a moment, staring at it, remembering the captain's warning. My first thought was to walk over, test the handle, and reassure myself it was nothing, but unease coiled in my chest. I told myself it had to be pressure equalization, or maybe the ship's natural sway, yet the lock clicking into place like an invisible hand had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The bay lights flickered once overhead, and the hair on my arms rose. I didn't approach the door. Instead, I packed up my notes and forced myself to head back toward the crew quarters, though every step felt heavy as if the corridor itself wanted me to look back. I didn't. That night I couldn't sleep, not because of noise, but because of the silence that followed. The next morning, I casually mentioned the door to one of the engineers, a man named Harlan, who had been aboard far longer than I had. He paused, his expression tightening for the briefest moment before he shrugged it off with a forced laugh. "Doors stick all the time," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Later I overheard him whispering to another crew member, and though I couldn't make out the words, I knew they were talking about me. It was the first time I realized that everyone on board carried the same weight of unspoken fear, pretending not to believe in the very rules that governed our survival. Over the following days, I began to pay attention to the doors in the ship. Most stayed propped open, secured with thick latches, especially in high-use corridors. But sometimes, I'd notice one closed when I could have sworn it had been left open moments earlier. The locks always seemed too deliberate, never casual. Each time I would stop and watch from a distance, my breath shallow, waiting to see if someone emerged. No one ever did. The silence after each closing was worse than any noise could have been, like the ship itself had just swallowed something whole. One evening, after dinner, a commotion broke out in the mess hall. A young deckhand named Ellis had gone missing. His bunk was empty, and no one had seen him since he went to check inventory in one of the storage compartments. The captain's face was grim as he ordered a search of the vessel. We split into pairs, scouring the narrow passages and compartments, calling out his name. I didn't want to admit it aloud, but my stomach twisted with the memory of the locked door I had seen just 2 nights before. My partner and I searched the lower corridors, our flashlights cutting through the dim light. Every closed door made me flinch, especially when I noticed locks engaged where I knew they hadn't been before. "Probably just the swell," my partner muttered, when he saw my hesitation, but I could tell he didn't believe his own words. We tried the handles of a few compartments, all sealed tight, the metal refusing to budge. My pulse quickened as I wondered if Ellis might be trapped inside, but I couldn't bring myself to force a latch. The captain's rules pressed at the back of my mind, heavier than the steel walls around us. Eventually, the search was called off, and Ellis was never found. The captain gathered us again and repeated the rules, his voice low and steady, warning us never to question them. I felt every pair of eyes dart around the room, each of us silently recalling the same thoughts but too afraid to voice them. That night, lying in my bunk, I stared at the ceiling, listening for the faintest sound of metal shifting. Somewhere deep in the vessel, I thought I heard the muffled echo of a hand pounding against steel, but no one else stirred. I buried my head under the pillow and prayed it was just my imagination. A few nights later, I awoke thirsty and decided to fetch some water from the galley. The ship was quiet, only the hum of the engines below vibrating faintly through the floor. As I turned down the corridor toward the kitchen, I noticed the faint outline of a door slowly closing at the far end. The lever slid into place with a metallic certainty, and I froze mid-step. My breath caught in my throat as a sound drifted through the sealed metal, soft, desperate scratching, followed by a muffled voice whispering my name. I nearly bolted forward, every instinct screaming to rip the handle open, but the memory of the missing deckhand clawed at my thoughts. My heart pounded, sweat dripping down my spine, as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, shifting from my name to pleas for help. I took one shaky step back, then another, every nerve in my body screaming that what I heard wasn't Ellis, and it wasn't human. Just as I turned to flee, the scratching stopped all at once, leaving only silence that pressed in heavier than the ocean itself. That silence didn't comfort me, it felt like being watched. I stumbled back to my quarters, locking the door behind me, even though I knew locks didn't matter on this vessel. My hands shook as I lay in the dark, trying to convince myself it was exhaustion or hallucination, but deep down I understood. The rules weren't there to discipline us, they were warnings carved from experience, passed down by survivors, and now I knew why the first rule mattered so much. What waited behind those doors wasn't meant to be freed. The night after the scratching at the sealed door, I couldn't shake the tension pressing against my chest, and that was when the captain reminded us of Rule 2. Always keep a light with you after midnight, no matter how well you know the vessel. At first I thought it was unnecessary, because the ship's halls were equipped with overhead bulbs, humming faintly with electricity. But as midnight came and went, I began to notice strange inconsistencies. Some lights flickered only when I passed beneath them, as if responding to my presence. Others dimmed so low I could barely make out the corridor ahead, forcing me to rely on the flashlight clipped to my belt. It felt like the vessel was testing me, watching to see if I followed the rule. I told myself that wiring could degrade, connections could corrode in the salty air, and circuits could fail, but it never seemed random. The engineer Harlan once muttered that the power system was solid, reinforced for long expeditions, and that these blackouts didn't make sense. He wouldn't admit it in front of the captain, but I could see the same fear in his eyes that haunted the rest of us. One night, as we shared coffee in the mess hall, he admitted in a hushed voice that he'd seen the lights go out in one corridor, only to find footprints on the floor when they flickered back. "Bare feet," he whispered, staring into his cup, and they weren't his. He didn't need to explain who his was. We all thought of Ellis. I carried my flashlight everywhere after that, clutching it tighter than I cared to admit. The beam cut sharp lines in the darkness, and even though it offered comfort, it also revealed things I wished I hadn't seen. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of water dripping along the walls where no pipes ran, leaving dark stains that disappeared before anyone else could notice. Other times, I'd sweep the beam across a corridor and catch a shadow darting around the corner, too fast and too deliberate to be explained by tricks of the light. Each time my stomach twisted with dread, and I found myself repeating silently that as long as I followed the rules, I'd be safe. One night, the vessel rocked harder than usual, a storm raging above, though we couldn't see it. I woke in my bunk, the motion disorienting, and reached instinctively for my flashlight. The corridor outside was dark, every bulb extinguished as though the ship had exhaled and put itself to sleep. My heart hammered as I clicked the flashlight on, its narrow beam cutting through the black. The silence was unnerving. No voices, no footsteps, just the low hum of machinery far below. I crept forward, every step cautious, my light trembling with the shake of my hands. Halfway down the hall, I thought I saw someone standing ahead, but when I blinked, the space was empty again. In the galley, I found the cook, a burly man named Rivas, sitting at the table with his flashlight clenched in one hand, his knuckles white. He didn't look up when I entered, just muttered, "They move when the dark settles in." His words sent a chill through me, and I didn't ask who they were. We sat in silence, both beams of our flashlights trembling faintly across the steel walls, until the overhead lights flickered back to life. Neither of us spoke about it the next day, but the fear in his eyes told me he had seen more than I wanted to know. The strangest thing happened a week later, when I forgot my flashlight during a midnight inspection. I had been half asleep, fumbling with my boots, and convinced myself I wouldn't need it just to check the air scrubbers. Halfway down the corridor, the lights above flickered and died, leaving me submerged in absolute black. I froze, the kind of darkness where you lose all sense of direction, your own breathing sounding foreign in your ears. Panic clawed at me, and I pressed my hands to the walls, trying to feel my way forward, but the steel felt wrong, slick, almost pulsing, as though alive. In that pitch black, I heard it again, the faint shuffle of bare feet against metal. My lungs seized, and I strained to listen, hoping it was just another crew member, but the sound came from both sides of the corridor, moving closer with slow, deliberate steps. Then a voice whispered so close to my ear, I could feel the breath, though no one touched me. "Why did you leave the light behind?" My scream caught in my throat as I stumbled forward, blind and trembling, desperate to reach the nearest lit section. When the lights flickered back, I was standing inches from a sealed door, its lock engaged tight. My heart nearly stopped when I realized I had been led straight to it. After that night, I swore I would never step into the corridors without a flashlight again. Still, curiosity gnawed at me, the way the darkness seemed to hunt, to lure me closer to places I wasn't meant to go. I asked Harlan if he had ever heard the whispers, and he stiffened immediately, shaking his head too quickly. But later, as we worked in silence, he muttered under his breath, "They'll use any voice you trust." He refused to say more, his hands trembling as he tightened bolts that didn't need tightening. I pretended not to hear, but his warning sank into my bones. The following week, during another blackout, I was paired with Rivas to inspect the engine levels. We both carried lights, sweeping the beams ahead of us as we moved carefully down the stairs. The air was damp and heavy, the metal dripping condensation, and the hum of the engines seemed distant, like we were moving away from them instead of closer. Then my light flickered, dimming though the batteries were fresh. Rivas hissed through his teeth, his own beam shaking as he muttered, "Don't stop, keep moving." I did though, every instinct screamed to turn back. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, the air grew colder, the condensation freezing into thin webs of ice along the walls. When the lights finally returned, we found ourselves standing in front of another sealed compartment door, one that neither of us remembered being there before. My stomach turned as I saw the lever already locked in place, though I hadn't heard it close. Rivas stared at it with wide eyes, then grabbed my arm and yanked me back, whispering fiercely that we needed to leave. I asked him what he had seen, but he wouldn't answer, dragging me up the stairs until we burst into the dim glow of the upper corridors. His silence scared me more than anything else, because silence on the vessel always meant something had followed you. That night, I lay awake in my bunk, gripping my flashlight tight even though the overhead lights were on. My eyes darted to the door every few seconds, expecting it to close on its own. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the faintest sensation of someone standing just beyond the thin metal wall, waiting for me to falter. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of walking endless corridors in darkness, doors slamming shut behind me, locks clicking like a chorus, and voices whispering from every corner, "Don't let the light die." The next day, the captain announced quietly at breakfast that another crewman had gone missing. No one asked how. We all knew what had happened, even if we wouldn't admit it. As the others whispered nervously, my eyes wandered to the ceiling lights humming above us, wondering how long they would stay on. Because on this vessel, darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence of something else entirely, something waiting for its chance to step closer when the beams went out. After the captain announced the second disappearance, my nerves were raw, and that was when he reminded us of Rule 3. If you hear your name spoken in the corridors, do not answer. It struck me as the strangest warning yet, but after what I had experienced with the voices in the dark, it felt less like superstition and more like a desperate attempt to keep us alive. I tried to laugh it off with the others, pretending it was just paranoia from isolation, but the truth was I already knew how real it was. The whispers I had heard during the blackout hadn't just used my name, they had spoken it in the voices of people I trusted. I began to pay closer attention as I walked the corridors, listening not just with my ears, but with the tight pull of instinct in my chest. Most of the time, the vessel was alive with its usual groans and hums, but sometimes I would swear I heard faint murmurs trailing just behind me. I told myself it was the engines carrying sound oddly through the metal, yet when the whispers grew clearer, that excuse dissolved. Once late at night, as I made my way back from the galley, I froze at the sound of my name spoken softly, a perfect mimic of my mother's voice. She had been dead for years, and hearing her call out in the belly of a ship, hundreds of miles from shore, nearly dropped me to my knees. I didn't answer, though every fiber of me longed to. The tone had been gentle, almost pleading, the kind of voice she used when I was a child afraid of storms. My throat burned with the effort of staying silent, and I hurried back to my quarters without looking back. That night, I dreamt of her standing outside my door, hand resting on the handle, whispering my name in a loop that never ended. When I woke, sweat soaking my sheets, the door to my cabin was closed tighter than I had left it. The lock was engaged. I hadn't touched it. Harlan, the engineer, eventually noticed my unease and pulled me aside one afternoon. His face was gaunt, eyes bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept in days. In a low voice, he admitted that he had once broken the third rule early in his career. He told me he had answered when a crewmate called for him, only to find the corridor empty. "It's never their voice," he muttered, gripping my arm hard enough to hurt. "It just sounds like it. And once you answer, it keeps coming back." I wanted to press him for details, but the terror in his expression was enough to silence me. That evening, while running diagnostics near the ballast tanks, I heard it again, this time in Ellis's voice. The missing deckhand called my name, his tone panicked, desperate, echoing faintly down the steel hallway. My flashlight beam trembled as I froze in place, heart pounding in my ears. He called again, closer this time, and I felt the overwhelming urge to respond, to tell him I was there, to rush forward and help. But something in me screamed that if I spoke, if I gave the thing in the dark my attention, it would step fully into this world. My jaw ached from clenching as I forced myself to remain silent. The corridor stretched impossibly long in that moment, shadows thickening at the edges of the beam. I took slow, deliberate steps backward, my hand pressed against the cold wall for balance. The voice followed, shifting tones from Ellis to my mother, then to Rivas, each one perfectly mimicked. By the time I reached the ladder to climb back up, it whispered my name in my own voice, a distorted echo that nearly drove me to break. I scrambled upward, breath ragged, until I reached the safety of the lit deck above. When I glanced back down, the shadows at the base of the ladder seemed to shift, like something had been waiting there, just out of sight. That night at dinner, I noticed others reacting to the same phenomena. One of the junior scientists flinched violently when someone across the table casually said her name, only to realize it had been a genuine question. She laughed it off, embarrassed, but her hands shook for the rest of the meal. The rules were seeping into all of us, turning normal interactions into tests of suspicion and restraint. The line between real voices and false ones blurred until I doubted every sound I heard, even in crowded rooms. The vessel had a way of isolating us, even when we weren't alone. A week passed before the next incident, though I never stopped dreading the inevitable. I was walking toward the research bay when I heard my name again, this time firm, authoritative, the captain's voice. I stopped dead, every muscle locking tight. The sound came from behind me, though I had just seen the captain in the opposite direction, heading to the bridge. My pulse thundered in my ears as the voice repeated my name, sharper now, tinged with irritation. Against every instinct, I turned my head slightly, just enough to glimpse the corridor behind me. It was empty, the overhead lights flickering faintly, as though struggling to stay lit. I forced myself forward, each step heavier than the last, the voice growing louder, angrier, until it sounded like a roar filling the narrow hall. My teeth ground together as I kept my lips sealed, the urge to respond clawing at me like a physical pain. At last, I stumbled into the research bay, collapsing against the console, the door sealing behind me. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the table, forcing myself to breathe. I knew then that the voices weren't random. They wanted to lure me, to drag me toward places on the vessel that didn't belong to us. Later that night, as I lay in my bunk, the whispers returned. This time, they didn't call my name once or twice, but endlessly, in a chorus of voices I recognized, and some I didn't. They pressed at the edges of my thoughts, filling the silence with temptation. I clutched my flashlight, eyes wide open in the dark, willing myself not to answer, not to give in. But as exhaustion pulled at me, I swore I felt a breath against my ear, a voice so low it was almost inside my skull, whispering my name one final time. And when I turned my head toward the sound, the door to my cabin shuddered, as though something outside had leaned against it. The lock rattled once, then fell silent. The lock on my cabin door had stopped rattling hours ago, but sleep never came. When the shift bell finally rang, I dragged myself to the mess, hollow-eyed, only to find the captain waiting. He reminded us in that clipped, emotionless tone of his about Rule 4, never look out of the portholes after midnight. His timing wasn't lost on me. It felt as if he knew the voices had circled me last night, knew I had nearly broken. The rule sounded absurd on paper. What harm could there be in glancing at the sea through reinforced glass? But my instincts were already raw enough to accept it. I didn't laugh like some of the newer recruits did. The research vessel had dozens of small round portholes along its decks, most of them overlooking black water that seemed endless in every direction. By day the sight was monotonous, even comforting, but at night it was another matter entirely. When the ship lights dimmed, the sea pressed against those windows like something alive, swallowing the moonlight and reflecting nothing back. It wasn't just darkness out there, it was a living absence, a void that wanted you to stare too long. I started noticing how some of the older crew members avoided the corridors that ran past the glass after midnight. They would take longer routes, winding through the bowels of the ship, just to avoid passing those cold circles in the wall. It was Ellis's disappearance that made me first suspect the rule was more than paranoia. A week before he vanished, he had been spotted on the observation deck after hours, leaning close to one of the portholes as though listening. A technician swore he had seen Ellis whispering to the glass, one hand pressed flat against it. When questioned, Ellis had only shrugged, saying he thought he saw movement in the water, some flash of pale light. None of us took it seriously until he was gone. When I asked where he might have gone missing, the technician hesitated, then admitted, that same deck, right near the portholes. I tested myself one night, walking the corridor outside the lab, when the ship's clocks ticked past midnight. My flashlight beam skimmed over the riveted walls, pausing just shy of the glass. The pull was immediate, a sensation like static in my skull urging me to look. I forced my eyes away, but the urge built until it felt like something just beyond the frame was moving in sync with my footsteps. My neck prickled, as if unseen eyes tracked me from outside, gliding alongside the vessel in perfect silence. When I reached the far door and slammed it behind me, my heart was racing like I'd just escaped a predator. It wasn't until days later that I slipped. I had been assigned to a late-night inspection, exhaustion dulling my vigilance, when I passed a porthole on the starboard side. Without thinking, I glanced out. At first I saw nothing but the void of the deep, darker than ink. Then slowly, pale shapes began to stir, as though rising from unimaginable depths. At first I thought they were schools of fish, until I realized they weren't swimming, they were watching. Rows of luminous eyes, huge and unblinking, stared back at me through the glass, their glow faint but unmistakable. My stomach dropped, and before I could wrench my gaze away, one of them shifted closer, pressing a shape against the porthole. The impression was almost human, a face distorted and elongated, mouth opening far wider than it should have. The glass fogged as though it exhaled against it, though we were hundreds of meters above the surface. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, until the corridor lights flickered and steadied. When I looked again, the porthole was empty, only black water beyond, but the outline of a handprint, slick and wet, remained on the inside of the glass. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't touch it, couldn't. By morning, it had vanished, leaving no trace at all. After that night, I refused to go near the windows. I found excuses to stay in interior sections of the vessel, volunteering for work that kept me in the engine rooms or storage bays. Still, the temptation lingered. More than once, I woke in the middle of the night to find myself standing barefoot in the corridor, mere steps away from a porthole, with no memory of leaving my bunk. It was as if something out there had called me in my sleep, guiding me like a puppet toward the glass. Each time, I forced myself back to my cabin, trembling with the realization that sooner or later, I might not wake up in time. Other crew weren't so lucky. I heard whispers about a junior scientist found staring at the porthole outside the mess, eyes wide and unblinking, unresponsive no matter how hard they shook him. When he finally snapped out of it, he screamed so violently he had to be restrained. They locked him in the infirmary afterward, but by the next morning, his bunk was empty. The only sign he had been there was the salt water pooled on the floor, far too much for any human body to contain. The captain never announced his disappearance. He didn't need to. The fear in our eyes said it all. By now, I avoided entire decks of the ship. If a duty required me to pass a porthole after midnight, I'd walk with my head down, eyes squeezed shut, one hand trailing the wall until I was clear. But the pull was always there, stronger each night, like gravity bending me toward the windows. Some of the veterans whispered that the ocean itself was alive, that it used the portholes as eyes, peering in, searching for cracks in our discipline. One wrong glance was all it needed to mark you, to draw you closer until you belonged to it. Last night, I nearly broke again. A storm raged outside, waves hammering the hull so hard the walls seemed to breathe. I made the mistake of pausing in a corridor, exhaustion clouding my judgment, when a pale glow pulsed through the glass at my side. It wasn't lightning, it was steady, rhythmic, like the beat of a colossal heart deep beneath the waves. My breath fogged the air as I stood frozen, every instinct screaming not to look. The glow brightened, shadows shifting, until I swore something massive pressed against the hull. I ran before I could lose myself, not daring to check if the glow followed. But when I reached my cabin, I noticed something I hadn't before, a thin smear of salt water streaking the inside of my door, as if a wet hand had dragged itself across it. And tonight, as I write this, I can hear the faint tapping on the glass of the porthole just 3 feet from my bunk. The tapping on my porthole lasted most of the night, sometimes faint, sometimes loud enough to make the glass tremble. I buried my head under the thin blanket, waiting for morning, but the sound worked its way under my skin. By the time the shift bell rang, I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. That was when the captain reminded us of Rule 5. Never follow footsteps on the deck when no one is there. He said it casually, like a weather report. But my stomach twisted. The way his eyes lingered on me made it feel less like a warning, and more like a test. The footsteps began the following night. They were slow and deliberate, echoing along the upper deck above my cabin. At first, I thought it was just another crewman finishing a late watch, but the rhythm never changed. Step, pause, step, pause, as though whoever it was wanted me to notice. My pulse quickened as I lay in the dark, straining to hear if the sound would fade. It didn't. The longer I listened, the clearer it became that only one set of feet moved up there, never crossing paths with the usual night watchman. Something about that solitary pace felt wrong. When I stepped into the corridor to check, the sound grew sharper, echoing from the metal overhead. I climbed the narrow stairs to the deck, my flashlight beam cutting through the mist. The footsteps stopped the moment I emerged. The deck stretched empty before me, salt spray stinging my eyes, but not a single soul in sight. My light skimmed across wet footprints leading from the bow to the stern, spaced evenly as though someone had just walked them moments earlier. I should have turned back then, but exhaustion and curiosity made me hesitate. My boots moved without permission, following the trail. The prints glistened in the moonlight, but they weren't quite human. The toes looked elongated, webbed impressions pressed too deeply into the slick surface, as if the weight behind them was heavier than it should have been. I followed them past the lifeboats, past the research cranes, until they veered toward the railing. The final prints ended at the very edge of the deck, pointing outward. Beyond that, only black water churned. My light caught on faint ripples below, as though something massive had just slipped beneath the waves. I staggered back, realizing the truth. There had never been anyone on deck at all. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. My ears strained for the sound to return, and sure enough, just before dawn, the footsteps began again. This time they circled above me, slow and patient, as if pacing directly over my bunk. The metal groaned with each step, vibrating through the ceiling into my bones. I gripped my blanket, fighting the urge to get up. When the morning bell finally rang, the sound cut off instantly, like a recording switched off. I dragged myself to the mess hall with hollow eyes, but no one else mentioned hearing it. That silence was almost worse than the noise itself. By the third night, I wasn't alone. Ellis, or what remained of him, had returned. I heard the footsteps again, but this time they didn't stay on deck. They moved down the stairs, into the corridors, closer with each deliberate step. My breath caught as the sound halted outside my cabin door. The air grew damp, heavy with the stink of salt water. I couldn't help myself. I leaned close, pressing my ear against the thin metal. For a long moment, nothing. Then faintly, a wet inhale on the other side, like lungs filling with brine. My knees buckled, and I staggered back, clutching the bunk frame until dawn broke. The captain cornered me at breakfast, eyes cold as ice. He didn't ask questions. He never did, but I saw the answer in the set of his jaw. He knew I had nearly followed again. That was the point of Rule 5. Those steps weren't sounds to investigate. They were bait, drawing us closer, promising answers we weren't meant to survive. The silence of the other crew made sense now. They all heard it too, but no one dared acknowledge it aloud, as though even speaking of it might call the footsteps closer. That night, I stuffed wax in my ears, hoping to muffle the sound. It worked for a while, dulling the sharp rhythm into muted thuds, but my mind filled in the rest, recreating every step as vividly as before. Worse, the vibration carried through the floor, through my bunk, until I swore I could feel bare feet pressing against the underside of the boards, pacing beneath me like a predator waiting for me to lean down. The wax didn't save me, it only made me more aware of how impossible it was to block them out. I'm writing this now because the sound has returned, louder than ever. The footsteps no longer linger above or outside. They move inside my cabin, circling me though the door is still locked. I can see damp prints forming across the floorboards, each one fresh, glistening, trailing closer to where I sit. I refuse to look up, refuse to follow, but the circle tightens with every pass, and now the wet prints have stopped just behind my chair. The wet prints had stopped behind my chair, but the air still tasted of salt, and that was when the captain leaned over and reminded me, quietly and without theatrics. Rule 6. Never let seawater touch your skin after midnight. I didn't expect his voice to tremble, but it did. The kind of small human crack that tells you an order is forged from experience, not legend. He didn't lecture. He only said that seawater carried things the surface didn't, and that those things were hungry for any living warmth they could reach. I swallowed hard and nodded, feeling the chill that rule names can leave in your bones when they're actually meant to save you. That night, the porthole next to my bunk bled a thin smear of seawater across the inside of the glass, and I watched it run in slow rivulets until it pooled into a bead that trembled like a trapped insect. I told myself it was condensation at first, then a leak from the waves, then anything that would allow me not to picture hands in the dark pressing against the hull. I slept with my flashlight in my fist, and my blanket pulled tight to my chin, counting breaths until dawn. When I woke, the bead of water had disappeared and there was no trace of moisture on the metal, only a faint salty scent that lingered in my clothes. Over the next days, the rule wrapped around the crew like a second uniform. We all moved with the same small rituals: towels hung by the door, boots stored on racks, sleeves rolled down even when the air pressed hot and close. A rookie slipped once, clumsy with coffee and nerves, and the salt water from a spilled cup splashed across his wrist at 3 a.m. He laughed it off at first, but you could see the way his fingers trembled afterward, as if the ocean had touched a thread inside him and tugged. The captain watched him closely after that, and the boy never drank in the mess again after midnight. He kept a permanent bandage on his wrist, as if to remind himself of the line he must not cross. You learn to read a ship by its small betrayals, a condensation line that appears where it shouldn't, a drip that forms only in the black hours, a gust of cold air from an unseen seam. One fog-thick night, I was on the observation deck, checking external cameras with Harlan, he of the hollow eyes, and he frowned at the monitor, fingers skimming controls without purpose. The attic of static on the feed shifted, and when we adjusted the contrast, blotches swam into view, thin translucent shapes that moved against the current, like fish caught in a net moving of their own will. They brushed the hull in the footage, and every time they did, a thin thread of light traced the path of the touch like a scar. Harlan closed the monitor and didn't speak for a long time. The rules start to feel like superstition until they aren't. One evening, after a long shift cataloging specimens, I washed my hands in the communal sink, and out of habit, dunked my forearms in the basin to wake myself. The overhead clock read 0:07. For a second, I didn't consider the time. I was thinking of labels and notes, cross-checks and the ongoing list of missing crew. My skin came up chilly under the fluorescence, and I stepped back from the sink, but not before a bead of rinse water rolled down my wrist and onto the deck. Someone in the corner of the room gasped, a sound strangled and small, and the basin's surface appeared to ripple, though there was no steam. I wrapped my robes tighter and left without drying fully, feeling exposed and foolish. After that, I started sleeping in long sleeves, socks pulled up, clothes kept on instead of stowed, and towels pressed against the spaces where my skin might glint exposed to the air. Others followed. The superstition became a practical armor. We taped bandages over cuts, slept with wristbands, taped the cuffs of our shirts closed, yet no barrier ever felt adequate. Once Rivas, who'd always been reckless in ways that had amused us before, caught a dribble of seawater on his knuckle as he hauled in a sample crate. He laughed and shrugged, saying, "It's only water," but that night, he stood in the corridor with his face like a man who had been told the truth and preferred not to know it. The next morning he whispered to me that the salt tasted wrong on his tongue, metallic and acrid, like iron filings. The night the storm came, the sea opened its throat and bled itself across the ship in sheets, flecking the decks with brine, as if testing the seams. We secured equipment, checked bolts, and strapped ourselves to ladders to keep from being thrown into the bulkheads. Between the thunder and the roar of wind, people moved like shadows. We barely spoke, following the ritual of rules in steady hands. I woke sometime after midnight, in that edge sleep where the mind opens doors it should not, and in the silence between gusts, I heard wet scuffling that seemed to trace every exterior surface of the hull. It circled the vessel once, slow and patient, as if tasting our defenses like lips brushing a shell. I did not notice first when the water came through my cabin seam. I felt it, a cold smear at my ankle that crawled up in a creeping clinical line, precise and deliberate. I bolted upright, heart pounding a drumbeat I could feel in my molars, and stared at the floor where a wet crescent spread like ink. I wanted to scream, to wake everyone, but the memory of Ellis's face, a young man whose bunk lay cold and empty, kept my throat closed. I grabbed towels and pressed them to the seam, my fingers numbed by cold and by fear, and for a long time, I sat there, listening to the wind and the slow, purposeful sound of water moving through the ship like fingers testing locks. I thought of the captain's words, of the rule that had been whispered in my ear like a benediction that was also a command. Being drenched after midnight is not like getting wet in daylight. Daylight washes a person clean of fear and offers witnesses. Nighttime water is secretive, a conspirator in darkness. The salt that seeped into my socks that night felt like a living thing, working its way into fabric, into skin, into the small fissures of sleep where memories and dreams seed. I spent the rest of the watch drying every corner of my cabin, knots in my fingers from wringing rags, muttering to myself that rules are rules for a reason. As dawn broke, the water line had receded, but my skin carried the chill, a porous memory that did not fade with sunlight. Something changed in the crew after that storm. We became more rigid, more ritualistic, each of us performing the rule like a liturgy. Someone fashioned little waterproof sleeves out of spare plastic and tape. Someone else rigged the showers to close with a delayed latch, so there would be no accidental splash past midnight. We traded stories of brushes with the ocean, footprints on decks, pale hands pressed to portholes, whispers that came through the ballast like voices in a tide pool, and every anecdote ended with the same quiet moral: don't touch the water after midnight. The rule no longer felt like a superstition. It had become a law written into our bodies, narrated by breath and the space between heartbeats. Tonight, as I write this, the smell of salt is strong in the cabin again, and towels lie heavy and soaked on the floorboards where I wrung them out an hour ago. My arm still prickles from where a smear of water ran past my cuff. I scrubbed and rewrapped it until the skin beneath turned raw. Outside, the ocean is an endless black, a muscle moving under moonlight, and the ship creaks as it rides the swell. I can hear faint movements on the deck above, like something pacing to the rhythm of the waves, and I realize, with a clarity that has nothing to do with sleep, that the rule is not merely to prevent us from being wet, it is to keep the living and the wanting apart. A sound just now scraped across the corridor, deliberate and close, and my breath hitched. The towels at my feet were still heavy with salt and memory when a single cold touch traced from my ankle up the back of my hand, as if hands I could not see were testing for openings. I sat very still, palms tight around the pen in front of me, the light over my bunk a thin, defiant disk. The touch stopped at my wrist. The water waited there, like a question. The cold touch at my wrist lingered long after it should have dried, a phantom sensation that left me trembling, even in the safety of my cabin. I sat awake until morning, too afraid to close my eyes, and when the captain passed me in the corridor, he didn't ask what had happened. He only said, with that flat, heavy voice of his, "Rule 7, never respond when someone calls your name from the water." I wanted to ask how he knew I had felt something last night, but his gaze was enough. He wasn't warning me for the future. He was reminding me not to fail when it came for me again. The first time I heard it was subtle, almost easy to dismiss. We were out on deck, checking the winches after a day of rough seas, and the others had gone below to eat, while I lingered, coiling ropes by hand. The waves slapped against the hull, and in that rhythm, I thought I heard a syllable, stretched thin by the wind. My name, carried low and steady, as if someone had called from the swell below. I froze, the rope slipping through my fingers, heart hammering against my ribs. I leaned over the railing, before I remembered the captain's words. The sea below was restless and dark, but between the foaming crests, I swore I saw something pale flash beneath the surface, waiting for me to answer. After that, the voices came often. Sometimes they whispered from beneath the portholes, brushing against the hull in tones just low enough to pass for imagination. Other times, they called sharp and clear, slicing through the night air like the voice of a friend I had known all my life. Once I was woken by a perfect imitation of my mother's voice, gentle and soothing, urging me to just come outside for a moment. My throat burned with the urge to answer, to cry out that she wasn't supposed to be here, but I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. The sound continued for hours, every inflection identical, as though she stood only feet away beyond the steel walls. Harlan wasn't as disciplined. I found him one night leaning over the railing, muttering into the waves. At first I thought he was praying, his lips moving in a desperate rhythm, but when I came closer, I realized he was answering something. His voice rose and fell in response to words only he could hear, and when I shouted his name, he startled, almost tipping forward into the black water. His eyes were wide, feverish, and he whispered, "They sound just like her. They know things they shouldn't." We pulled him back from the edge, but after that, he was never the same. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and within a week, his bunk was empty. The only thing left was a pair of boots by the door, their soles damp with seawater. I started to notice patterns in the calls. They never came during daylight, never in front of the whole crew. Always in the hours between midnight and dawn, always when I was alone, they would rise from the sea, soft at first, then sharper, like hooks sinking into the mind. Once as I stood in the lab, cataloging specimens, I heard my name in the exact voice of Ellis, the crewman who had vanished weeks before. It was uncanny, every detail right down to the rasp in his throat from cigarettes. "Help me," the voice begged, over and over, just below the floorboards. My hands shook as I fumbled with vials, refusing to answer. The pleading grew louder, more desperate, until I thought my eardrums would burst. Then, as suddenly as it began, silence fell, leaving me in a room that felt more like a tomb than a lab. The longer I resisted, the more personal the voices became. They whispered secrets I hadn't told anyone on the ship, memories from childhood, fears I had buried, promises I had broken. The night my father died, I had been too afraid to enter the hospital room, and I had always carried that guilt alone. But when the water called to me with his voice, wheezing and frail, saying my name exactly the way he had said it last, I nearly broke. Tears streamed down my face as I pressed my hands against my ears, rocking in my bunk like a child. "Just answer," it said. "Just one word, that's all I need." One night the temptation nearly claimed me. I had been woken by the sound of my sister sobbing, her voice rising from the sea as though she were drowning just outside my porthole. The glass vibrated with each cry, rattling like a cage. My nails dug crescents into my palms as I whispered to myself over and over, "Don't respond, don't respond, don't respond." My body leaned toward the glass against my will, every instinct screaming to shout back, to tell her I was there, that she wasn't alone. The sobs rose to a scream, piercing, unbearable. I thought my resolve would snap, and I opened my mouth, only to bite down so hard I tasted blood again. The scream cut off in an instant, leaving me shaking in the silence. The ocean doesn't need to hurt you directly. It only needs you to break your own rules. That realization haunted me in the days that followed, and I understood then why so many had vanished without a trace. They hadn't been dragged from the ship by brute force. They had answered, willingly, thinking they were saving someone they loved. They had offered themselves up to whatever waited below, seduced by the comfort of familiar voices. Once you speak, I knew, the sea owns you. Tonight the voices have returned, louder than ever. They aren't whispering now, they're calling in unison, dozens of voices layered together like a choir rising from the depths. Some I know, some I don't, but they all chant my name, over and over, filling the corridors with sound. The walls thrum with it, my bones vibrate, and no matter how tightly I press my hands to my ears, the noise cuts straight through. I can't tell if it's coming from outside or from inside my skull. And just now, in the middle of their chanting, one voice broke through clear and sharp above the rest. It wasn't a family member, or Ellis, or anyone I had lost. It was my own voice, calling from the water, begging me to come closer. When the voices finally faded, leaving only the pulse of my own blood in my ears, I sat shaking on the floor of my cabin. That's when the captain appeared, as though he had been waiting outside all along. He didn't ask what I'd heard. He didn't need to. He simply set a heavy canvas cloth down on the table and said, with an expression that made my stomach clench, Rule 8. Keep every mirror on the vessel covered after sundown. At first it sounded absurd. What could reflections possibly have to do with the things we faced out here? But then I remembered the sound of my own voice rising from the sea, and suddenly, the rule didn't feel absurd at all. It felt like a warning delivered just in time. The mirrors on a ship are few, but they matter. Polished brass panels in the captain's quarters, the small square glass nailed above the wash basins, the compact I kept tucked in my kit for shaving, all of them harmless by day, ordinary tools we took for granted. But once darkness fell, the crew treated them like venomous snakes. Every reflective surface was draped in heavy cloth, even the ones built into instrument panels, where glass shone faintly under the red glow of night lamps. I had assumed this was superstition, some sailor's ritual carried from port to port, but when I asked Harlan, back before he vanished, he had only said, "They're not mirrors at night, they're doors." I learned what he meant soon enough. The first night I forgot. It was only by accident. My cabin porthole had a small round mirror hung just beside it, and in my exhaustion, I left it uncovered. The storm outside rattled the hull, and I lay awake listening to the groan of steel and the hiss of rain. That's when I noticed it. Movement in the mirror that didn't belong to me. My reflection was there, pale and haggard in the lamplight, but behind it, the cabin seemed wrong. The angles stretched too far, shadows clung too thick, and in the corner just barely visible, something stood. I told myself I was imagining it, that fatigue was twisting my perception, but then my reflection blinked, and I hadn't. The shock punched the air out of me. My reflection's eyes shifted, glancing toward the figure in the corner, and then back at me with an expression I can only describe as pity. Slowly, carefully, it raised a hand and pressed a finger to its lips. A shushing gesture. My own hand remained limp at my side. I lunged forward and threw the canvas over the mirror, heart slamming against my ribs. Even beneath the cloth I thought I heard a faint tap tap tap, like fingernails against glass, until the storm finally swallowed the sound. In the morning, I folded the cloth tighter and swore never to forget again. But forgetting isn't the only danger. Some reflections don't wait to be uncovered. They find cracks. Cracks in discipline, cracks in routine. Ellis had been obsessive about covering mirrors, more than anyone else, almost fanatical. Yet one night, after a long shift, He stumbled into the mess hall without draping the cupboard glass. I was there when it happened. His reflection didn't mimic him. It lagged, just a fraction of a second, like an echo that couldn't quite keep up. We both saw it, and in that instant, he looked at me with sheer panic. "Don't move," he whispered. "If it gets ahead of me." He didn't finish. The reflection smiled first. Ellis screamed, bolting backward, but his mirror double pressed both palms against the inside of the glass. Its grin widened, too sharp, too human. The cupboard doors rattled as if under pressure, glass bowing outward. We tore the cloths from the hooks and slammed them over the surface, holding them there until our arms ached. When we dared to look again, Ellis's reflection was gone, but so was Ellis himself. His chair sat empty, his untouched food still steaming. Only the faint outline of his hands remained smudged against the inside of the cupboard glass. The crew grew quieter after that, shadows under their eyes deepening. At night, the corridors became dim tunnels lined with veiled shapes, each mirror wrapped like a corpse. Some swore they heard voices whispering from behind the cloths, low and coaxing, begging to be uncovered. I never dared test it, though temptation gnawed at me every time I walked by. Curiosity is the cruelest lure out here. It kills as surely as the sea itself. One evening, I caught myself mid-motion, fingers already curled around the edge of a cloth covering the washroom glass. I hadn't meant to move. Something had guided me, subtle as a tide pulling a boat off course. My pulse thundered as I forced my hand back to my side. In the silence that followed, I swear I heard laughter, muffled and distant, echoing from beneath the canvas. Still, the worst came 2 nights ago. The storm had knocked out power to half the vessel, and I was sent to secure supplies in the storage hold. The light from my lantern flickered against steel walls, and in one corner, I noticed a shard of glass glinting, a mirror fragment, cracked and forgotten, no larger than a handspan. I didn't see it until I was nearly on top of it. For a split second, my own face stared back, except it wasn't mine. The skin sagged as though waterlogged, eyes pale and bloated, mouth slightly open in a drowning gasp, and then in a voice muffled like sound traveling through water, it spoke. "Let me in." The lantern slipped from my grasp, and nearly went out as I staggered back. The shard trembled against the deck, vibrating with pressure from the other side. I kicked a tarp over it, and fled, refusing to look again. But I can still hear that voice in my head, soft and patient, waiting for the next chance. Now it's almost midnight again. I've checked every corner of my cabin twice, every mirror smothered beneath cloth. Still, the air feels wrong, heavy, charged. I know the thing in the shard hasn't forgotten me. I can feel it, pressing against the barrier, testing, waiting for me to falter. And as I write this, the cloth over my mirror just twitched, like something underneath has started to breathe. The twitching cloth over the mirror kept me frozen, until the lantern burned so low I could barely see my own hands. I didn't dare move it, didn't dare look, just sat listening to the faint rise and fall as though something on the other side was breathing through fabric. That was when I heard it. The soft rhythm of boots on steel, slow and deliberate, pacing the corridor just beyond my cabin door. At first I almost convinced myself it was one of the crew, but then I remembered the captain's words, spoken in that same hushed tone he used when introducing every other survival law. Rule 9. Never follow footsteps on the deck after midnight. The sound grew louder, echoing, as if whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to hear. It didn't march with purpose. It prowled, circling, pausing outside my cabin only to retreat and return again. My gut twisted because I knew the crew avoided these halls at night, every one of them tucked into bunks by the final bell. I pressed my back to the wall, holding my breath, but curiosity clawed at me like an itch I couldn't ignore. If it was nothing, just the ship settling, then the fear was eating me alive for no reason. But if it wasn't, then opening the door meant more than just a mistake. It meant an invitation. Harlan used to warn me about this one in particular. He'd sit hunched over his mug in the mess, eyes bloodshot, whispering stories of men who swore they'd heard their own footsteps following them across the deck. "It'll sound like someone you know," he told me once, leaning in close. "It'll mimic the gait, the weight, the way the captain's boots hit the steel, or the shuffle of Ellis when he dragged his left leg. But don't be fooled. If you follow, you won't come back. You'll just add another pair to the chorus." I laughed then, dismissing it. But now the sound outside my cabin was no longer random. It was mine. My pace. My exact stride pattern. The footsteps began to mimic perfectly the way I moved when I was restless, pacing the room at night. Left, right, a slight pause, then 3 quicker steps. My stomach dropped as realization dawned. Something was echoing me, wearing my rhythm like a mask. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound seeped through, steady and deliberate, like water leaking into a cracked hull. I whispered to myself that it wasn't real, that exhaustion was playing tricks, but the pressure in my chest kept building. The only thing stopping me from opening that door was the memory of Ellis disappearing into a cupboard reflection, and the certainty that the same fate waited if I gave in now. But temptation has teeth, and it bit deeper each second. The footsteps suddenly stopped, silence stretching so thick it roared in my head. Then faintly came the scrape of a boot against the floor, right outside my doorframe. My pulse hammered. Whoever stood there wasn't just passing through, they were waiting. My hand drifted toward the latch, as though compelled by invisible strings. I could almost hear my own voice in the back of my head whispering, "Just look, just confirm." The air itself felt charged, as though the ocean beyond the steel walls held its breath, waiting for me to decide. That's when I noticed the shadow leaking in beneath the door. At first it looked like the outline of boots, but then it spread wider, longer, until it stretched in unnatural shapes that didn't belong to any man. My skin prickled. I backed away, but the shadow crept farther under the doorframe, tendrils curling across the floor like smoke. I clutched the lantern, ready to smash it if I had to. But just as the darkness reached the edge of my boots, the captain's voice rang out from down the hall, sharp and commanding, calling my name. The shadow recoiled instantly, vanishing as if yanked back into the void. I wrenched the door open then, desperate to see him, but the corridor was empty. No captain, no crew, only the faint outline of wet footprints trailing away down the hall, leading toward the deck stairs. My chest seized, because they weren't mine anymore. They were too large, too heavy, and they glistened as though fresh from the sea. I should have stayed inside, but fear tangled with a reckless urge, pulling me forward. Each step I took made the prints stretch farther ahead, as if baiting me, daring me to keep going. The stairwell loomed, the metal slick beneath my boots, and the smell of salt water hit stronger than it ever had indoors. I gripped the rail, heart racing, and followed the wet trail until it ended abruptly at the deck. The night sky opened above me, black and endless, stars drowned out by heavy clouds. The ocean churned below, waves slapping against the hull in angry rhythm. For a moment there was nothing, no footsteps, no sound except the storm. Then faintly, directly behind me, I heard it again. My own footsteps, perfectly in sync with my racing heart. I spun around, lantern raised high, but the deck was empty. The prints had returned, circling me now, growing darker, wetter, as if something invisible walked them deeper into the steel. My breath came shallow, fogging in the night air. The prints stopped suddenly, only a foot away. I strained to see, every nerve screaming, until the silence broke, this time not with sound, but with pressure. The deck beneath me groaned, sinking slightly, as though something heavy stood just inches away. And then slowly, a single wet handprint appeared on the railing beside me, fingers curling tight, knuckles whitening against the steel. The handprint on the railing dripped seawater onto the deck, each drop loud as a hammer in the silence. I froze, staring at it, unable to move, as though my own muscles had been stolen by the same thing that made the prints. And then I heard it. My name, spoken in a voice so familiar it rattled me. It wasn't the captain, or Ellis, or even Harlan. It was my mother. She had been dead for years, her body buried thousands of miles inland. Yet here she was, her tone soft and pleading, rising from the waves. I remembered the warning the crew had drilled into me, the one I had always laughed off in disbelief. Rule 10. If you hear someone calling your name from the water, never answer. The voice called again, sweeter this time, like when she used to sing me awake as a child. The sound wrapped around me, coaxing, promising comfort I hadn't felt in years. My throat tightened, desperate to respond, to call out I'm here. My lantern flickered, light shrinking, and in that glow I saw the handprint tighten its grip on the railing, water streaming from its invisible palm. The ocean surged against the hull, timed with her words, as if every wave was a breath meant to lure me closer to the edge. I clamped my mouth shut, nails digging into my palms, but the urge to answer clawed at my chest until it hurt. I tried to retreat, but the voice shifted. No longer maternal, it became Harlan's, broken and raw, the way he sounded the last night I saw him alive. Help me, he begged, each syllable cracked with desperation. My pulse thundered in my ears. Logic screamed that it was impossible, that he was gone, swallowed whole by rules he had failed to follow. But grief has a way of blinding reason, and my feet edged closer to the railing without permission. I shook my head violently, muttering to myself, trying to drown the sound out, but the ocean always found a way to push through. The waves churned more violently, slamming the hull with enough force to spray salt across my face. The taste filled my mouth, briny and bitter, as though the sea itself was trying to seep inside me. The voice turned again, this time my own. Look at me, it whispered, perfectly matching my tone, the way I sounded when I spoke under my breath. Just one word, that's all it takes. My stomach dropped, a cold pit opening, as I realized the sea wasn't just mimicking voices, it was peeling pieces of us away, wearing them like bait. If I gave in, even once, I wouldn't just answer. I would belong to it. I stumbled back from the rail, but the handprint didn't release. Instead, another appeared beside it, and then another, until a row of dripping impressions lined the steel, fingers twitching as though something was climbing its way upward. I bolted toward the hatch, slamming it shut behind me, my lungs burning. But even inside, the voice followed, muffled through walls of steel, echoing through the pipes like the ship itself was repeating it. My name again and again, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, always just enough to make me want to break the rule. Sleep became impossible after that. Every night, the calls grew stronger, weaving into dreams until I woke gasping, half convinced I'd already answered. The crew avoided my eyes, their silence telling me they'd heard it too. They knew the water was patient. It didn't need you to break on the first night. It only needed to keep chipping away until your defenses cracked. I caught Ellis's replacement, a younger deckhand, standing at the railing once, whispering softly as though in conversation. His lips moved in sync with the tide. I yanked him back, shaking him awake, but his eyes remained glazed, fixed on the horizon. He vanished the following night, his boots found neatly beside the rail, his name still echoing faintly from the waves. The thing is, the voices don't stop. When one of us is taken, they keep adding. More and more familiar tones, each one closer to the bone, until it feels like the whole ocean is made of people I once loved. Lately, it has been whispering in the voice of someone I never thought I'd hear again. Her, the one I left behind when I boarded this cursed vessel. She calls for me now, every night, her tone soft, broken, begging for me to answer just once. And God help me, part of me wants to. Tonight the voices are louder than ever. They don't even wait for midnight anymore. They've already started, seeping into the walls like water through rust. My name slithers down the corridors, pooling beneath my door, wrapping around my bed. I can't block it out. I've stuffed my ears, buried my head under blankets, but the voices live inside my skull now. I know I'm close to breaking. My lips part in the dark, a whisper forming before I can stop it. And just as the word is about to slip free, something presses hard against my cabin door from the other side. 3 slow, deliberate thuds, as though whatever is calling has finally come aboard. The thuds against my door rattled the frame, each one spaced like a heartbeat, slow but deliberate, forcing me to count the silence in between. My throat tightened, but I didn't move, didn't speak, remembering the voices that had almost claimed me minutes before. I sat rigid in the dark until the blows stopped, replaced by footsteps retreating down the corridor. Only when the sound faded did I dare to breathe again. And it was then that I recalled the captain's gravest instruction, the one he rarely repeated and never explained. Rule 11. When the final bell tolls, do not be the last one on board. At the time, I had no idea what it meant. Now I feared I was about to learn. The final bell was different from the ship's routine watches. Every vessel keeps time with bells, but this one was older, heavier, its toll deeper than metal had any right to sound. We never saw the bell, only heard it, and it rang at no fixed hour, always unexpected. The first time I heard it, the vibration rattled through the hull like thunder beneath the waves. The crew reacted instantly, dropping tools, abandoning meals, rushing topside in a panic that seemed rehearsed. Only later did I realize why. The bell wasn't a signal for us, it was for them. Whatever lives in the deep listens when it tolls, and when it does, the vessel becomes a beacon. I asked the captain once, what happened if someone lingered, if they failed to reach the deck in time? His eyes hardened in a way I'd never seen before, and he only said, then the sea chooses. That was enough to silence me. But tonight, with the voices already bleeding through the walls and the air thick with tension, I knew the bell was coming. The ocean had been calling, and the rules always escalated. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. My skin prickled as though the steel around me anticipated it, humming faintly with dread. The bell tolled at 3:17 a.m. It began as a low vibration, almost inaudible, then swelled into a roar that shook bolts loose from the ceiling. I stumbled to my feet, lantern swinging wildly, and yanked my door open. The corridor erupted with motion as crew members spilled from their cabins, some half-dressed, eyes wide with the same animal fear. We surged together, boots hammering the steel as we climbed toward the upper deck. The sound of the bell grew sharper with every step, less like metal striking metal, and more like the deep, cavernous moan of something alive. At the stairwell, panic fractured our unity. Someone tripped, others shoved past, and the narrow passage became a snarl of limbs and shouts. I forced my way upward, lungs burning, the weight of the lantern dragging me down. The deck hatch loomed above, spilling faint moonlight into the dark, but as I reached for it, I realized with horror that I was nearly the last. Only one man stumbled behind me, a gaunt figure whose face I couldn't make out in the frenzy. The others had already spilled onto the deck, their shadows flickering in the storm-tossed light. I tried to quicken my pace, but something tugged at me, subtle at first, then stronger. My boots felt heavy, dragging as though the very ship resisted me. The man behind me groaned, a sound half human, half drowned, and my stomach turned cold. I didn't dare look back. The bell tolled again, louder now, its vibration rattling my bones. I lunged through the hatch, pulling myself onto the deck, the night air slapping me with rain and salt. The crew clustered at the rail, faces pale as they stared into the black waters below. The sea was boiling. That's the only word for it. The surface writhed with bubbles and waves that didn't follow the wind, as though something vast stirred beneath. Shapes flickered just below the surface, elongated, inhuman, stretching farther than my eyes could follow. Every toll of the bell drew them closer, their outlines circling the ship like predators. My breath caught when I realized they weren't circling randomly. They were counting. Each pass narrowed their orbit, each movement synchronized with the toll. The captain barked for order, his voice cutting through the storm, but I couldn't pull my gaze away. In that moment, the gaunt man who had been behind me stumbled out of the hatch. For a split second, relief surged through me. He had made it. I wasn't the last. But the relief curdled almost instantly, because the moment his boots struck the deck, the bell tolled one final time. The air froze, the sea stilled, and every shape in the water turned upward at once. The man looked at us, his mouth opening in confusion, then in horror as he realized what he had become. His body convulsed, water gushing from his mouth and eyes as though he had already drowned. His scream never escaped. It was swallowed whole by the storm as invisible hands yanked him off his feet. He slammed against the rail, bones snapping with sickening force, before vanishing into the black below. The sea erupted, swallowing him, and then it was still again. No one spoke, no one moved. We all knew what would have happened if he hadn't lagged behind. The rule was cruel, merciless, but it was clear the sea always claimed the last. My chest heaved with ragged breaths, rain mixing with sweat on my skin. I wasn't chosen this time, but the knowledge sat heavy in my gut. Because the bell will toll again. It always does. And someday, no matter how hard I run, I might be the last. Now I sit in my cabin, the echoes of that man's scream still clawing at my ears. My lantern is almost out, the mirror cloths twitch with unseen breath, and the voices are already rising from the water, calling my name in tones I can barely resist. The final bell hasn't tolled again yet, but I know it will, and when it does, I fear it won't matter how fast I run. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.